Hello, hello. If you're wondering where you are out there in New Play TV land, you're back at the 7th Annual No Passport Theater Conference, staging new theaters, challenging hierarchies. And we're starting the afternoon session, which is jam-packed, by the way. And the first session here now at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time is Better Than Barter, Artists and Scientists Redefine Collaboration, Mentorship and Community. And it's moderated by Lisa Phillips and Dana Whitco. And I know you have bios for those of you who are here live. You have little bios that you got at the door. For those of you online, I'll post it on the No Passport website. And if you're wondering who I am, I'm Caridad Svich. I'm the founder of No Passport. I'm a playwright. And my co-curators of this conference are Kristin Horton and Sharon Friedman of NYU Gallatin, which is where we are at this moment. And I'll hand over the mic to Lisa Phillips and Dana Whitco. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caridad. I'm Lisa Phillips. This is my collaborator and co-moderator, Dana Whitco. And I want to thank again Caridad and Sharon and Kristin for inviting us here today at this panel. And we are from an initiative called PositiveFeedback, which brings together artists and scientists for collaborations on work related to climate change. We're a collaboration that involves 3 institutions: Columbia University, New York University, and the City University of New York. And our various representative centers, such as the Earth Institute at Columbia University, the CUNY Institute for Sustainable Cities, and the Center for Creative Research at NYU. So what we're going to do today is we have 3 pairs of panelists. And I'm going to introduce them to you. They're going to take maybe just a minute or two to talk about what it is they've been working on together. And you have their bios in front of you, so I'm not going to go over and reread exactly what their history is and how they've gotten to here today. And then we're going to sort of lead them and hopefully all of you in some provocative dialogue and ask some questions that kind of focus on or pull together what we heard this morning from our wonderful earlier panels and keynote this afternoon from Todd London. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our pairs of panelists. We have, beginning on my left, Steve Cosson and Aaron Sherman. And we have Inez Garcia and Seth Baum. And joining us via Skype from another conference at Wesleyan University, we have Jeremy Picard and Nicole Davi, who are on that little screen. Maybe they're on the big screen. Looking great. So I'm going to just take this opportunity to let Steve and Aaron, just for a minute or two, talk about kind of what brought you together and what it is that you have worked on or are working on together, and then we'll shift to the next pair.
Great. I guess I should pop this out. How's that? Is that on? Oh, great. So I'm Steve Cosson, the artistic director of The Civilians, and we're here because The Civilians has a play that it is developed called The Great Immensity, which was inspired by a series of interviews and research and trips that my collaborator Michael Friedman and I did, exploring questions of climate change and environmental crisis. To give you just a very short background on the show, it was made with a completely insane process. In that we decided to sort of boldly go out into the world before we had any idea of what we were doing. So first made a trip and spent time on this research island in the middle of the Panama Canal, and then followed that up by a trip to Churchill, Canada in the Arctic Circle, and knew what we were interested in, explored a lot of ideas there through interviews and experiencing the work of the scientists. And from that, wrote this play with music about, and it's a story, it's a fictional play, but its subject really is the psychology of climate change communication, which sounds a little dry, but it isn't. It's something I've been thinking about now for a very long time. And it's, for me, it was my way in theater, in that ultimately a play about climate change, and it being a play is about people, and it's sort of about us and our relationship to this crisis. Aaron and I met because once we were into developing the script, Michael and I had a year-long relationship at Princeton. We were humanities fellows at the Princeton Environmental Institute, followed by the Princeton Atelier, which is in their art center, which is essentially a sort of active workshop class where we worked on the show in conjunction with 8 Princeton students. Aaron is one of them, now graduated. But our students were 4 science students and 4 theater students. And Aaron was on the science side, and I'll let her tell you about herself.
Hello. So I was not a... Thank you. I was not in the hard scientist, not a physical scientist, but a student of psychology, which was why I was so interested in this class. The sort of remit, according to some of the folks who have been involved in the Great Immensity, is to communicate climate change, not just to sort of mull over the issue. So I came into the class thinking, man, how can I use my, psychology knowledge and knowledge about why climate change is sort of, if someone wanted to make the perfect problem to foil humans' abilities to solve it, this would be it. It's hard in every single way. How could we use a play to turn those biases around and make people leave the theater empowered and feeling like this was their responsibility and they could do something and they would. And I learned that theater isn't really about that necessarily. But as I adjusted into that, I got a lot out of the class. I learned a lot about theater. And I like to think that I was helpful in that as we were thinking through, like, what are the characters experiencing, or like, what is it about the conjunction of the natural world and the human world and how humans think that has caused this disaster. At one point, I just wrote up a sheet of all of the human biases I could think of that were causing this issue, and did what I could. As Steve and I were talking about right before this, in some way, the play challenges you to break out of your biases and recognize that the system you're part of, the system that you are conditioned to behave within, is the entire problem. So the play is posing this question of whether you are merely that sum of your biases and going to stay within your system to justify the system, as some psych literature puts it, or whether you'll do something else. So I found it to be extraordinary and rare in a college class, for sure.
Thank you. Before I let Inez and Seth actually talk to you about their project, I thought it would be a good idea, folks up in the booth, if we could simply show their project. It's about a 30-second clip. So folks in the booth, if you want to go ahead and show that clip now, we'll have a look first at what their project is.
So I packed up all the stuff you had here, so it'd be easier for you.
Is all my stuff there? Even that vegetarian cookbook?
Yes. I think it's only fair that if you get the dog, I get the book. I want you to have Lulu.
Okay, Seth, Inez.
Thank God you laughed. Thank you. So my name is Inez. Hi. So Seth and I, how do we meet? That was the first part of this?
How did you meet? What are you doing?
Okay. So Seth and I actually met about a year ago, actually pretty much exactly a year ago, at CUNY's Nature, Ecology, and Society Colloquium. And no, I just lied, about exactly 2 years ago. And from there, we started talking, and it was like, oh, hey, you're a scientist. Oh, hey, I'm an artist. And we're both into climate change. And that became, you know what, we should do something. Like, we should actually do something. And then we started brainstorming stuff, and I actually came here for theater. So I was coming from theater, and I was like, well, anything in theater is going to take a really long time to make something worthwhile. But we kind of wanted to make something immediately. And I was like, well, I just saw a really funny Geico commercial the other day, and it made me laugh. And I can remember the name Geico, and I don't even have a car. And I was like, why don't we try to make like commercials, but they're for climate change? So we kind of like took that idea and kept working on it. And then we decided for the next NES colloquium, we would make a video. So that's that video that you just saw. So that's how we met. And like I said, I was trained here at the Playwrights Horizon studio for Tisch undergrad for theater. And my degree is in creating original work. So I was like a pig in mud. And I was just rolling around in it and having a good time and talking about climate change and figuring out what interests me about that. And Seth has been kind of my scientific mentor on what to talk about.
So I'm Seth. I do research on topics like climate change and nuclear war, and also aliens from outer space, which is a really awesome thing to say when there's a sign language translator there. I'm going to say that one more time. Aliens from outer space. Cool. It's a reoccurring theme for us climate change researchers, though. We understand that there's this big problem that we're staring down on it, but how to get the world to actually do something about it, we're not actually all that good at that type of thing. How to really reach people and connect with people. We have some ideas, but the partnership with Ines has been great in that, you know, the experience and expertise she brings in as an actress and theater director has, you know, I've personally gotten a lot out of it in terms of how to bring things to life. I mean, that video that you just saw, I have absolutely no idea how to do that. All I know is that if you eat less meat, then that's actually really good for climate change. And I can tell you all about that all day long, and it's true, but as far as how to get that to really resonate with people, it's been a good partnership, and that this idea for the video here, it's certainly not something I could have come up with on my own. I think it really emerged from our conversation. The concept with the video, what excites me about it is it bypasses all of the really thorny and contentious debate that exists about the science of climate change and goes straight to what we can actually do about it in a really positive fashion. I mean, this is a climate change video in which climate change plays absolutely no role, right? It's going straight to you know, promoting in a positive way one important thing that we can do to help out on climate change. And so it's, to me, I think got the potential to help things actually improve on climate change in a way that doesn't hinge on, you know, the outcomes of, you know, debates with, you know, our friends on Fox News and people like that, who might even disagree that climate change is a problem in the first place. And so I'm excited to see the video coming online and to hopefully produce more videos like this and see if that can help make a positive difference on the climate change issue.
Thanks, Seth. Jeremy and Nikki, if you're hearing me, you're up.
Can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
Great. Nikki always makes me talk first, so I'm going to make her talk first.
Oh, all right. Hi. So I'm a paleoclimatologist at Lamont Doherty. And I study. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Just making sure. I study tree rings most of the time. So I look at annual ring width from a tree to get a better understanding of what the climate was like for as long as trees are old. So going from several hundred years to several thousand years to try and understand cycles of drought or magnitude and impact of drought and the spatial, how it looks across the landscape and the impacts of drought on the landscape. So just to talk a little bit about just something Seth was mentioning, I feel like, and I'm obviously not alone, but I've read somewhere that put it nicely in a way that it resonates with me, that climate scientists are in a street war and they don't even know it. So I feel like not only do a lot of people not understand climate science and climate change, but they don't really have an understanding of what scientists do and who scientists are. And I think if they had a better understanding of how scientists work and what they're like with all their quirks, they would relate better not only to scientists but the actual science. So I was thrilled to work with artists like Jeremy and his group, because it's interesting as a learning experience to see the types of things they focus in on and the types of things that they communicate and how they can connect with an audience in a way that I never could. And it's an entirely different audience than I try to connect with. And just seeing how people respond and engage, it's just another way to talk about these important issues. And it's also very fun for me to get to work with artists, because I don't often hang out with artists. And then I realize how untalented I am.
Untrue. Okay. So I'm an eco-theater artist, self-proclaimed. I run a company called Superhero Clubhouse, and we basically we have a couple of our mission is essentially to make multidisciplinary minimalist performance that's performer-centered and an excellent theater, and I want to use that to ignite conversations about ecology and environmental issues. And what we're trying to do is not only ignite those questions with our audiences and communities, but then also pose a model to to the larger theater community about how theater might be made and might be made better and might be made more in sync with environmentalism and a sustainability movement. So a lot of what we do there's the work, the plays, and then that's accompanied by a greater philosophy. And so I'm working really hard at preaching the word of how to make green theater from beginning to end. Meaning, can it start with a playwright? Can a playwright strive to write a play that demands little as far as building materials, and that can be flexible to different kinds of spaces, and can be short, so it uses less energy in the lights and in the building, for instance? And then the end, can we end a production with no waste? Can we have zero waste that goes in a dumpster, for instance? So that accompanies our plays. But we have three initiatives with our company. One, we make independent work, and that's usually for adult audiences. They're full-length plays. Our current thing is this series of Planet plays, each one about a particular environmental topic. And there's one, actually, we're premiering next weekend, so this is my plug. It's called Mars, a play about mining, and it's a dance theater piece inspired by the history of Appalachian coal mining. But it's a 75-minute piece featuring dancers and actors and musicians and graphic art. It's adapted from a graphic novel. It's kind of this big epic thing, but it's rooted in very real questions about a very complex issue, which is a lot of the world still gets its power from coal, and yet we're doing things like destroying the environment and culture of Appalachia in order to get coal more easily and more cost effective. So what do? And then so what we create is a big allegory, in this case, a big sort of epic sci-fi allegory, but every play is a little bit different. So that's one initiative. The other initiative is work with fifth graders every year in Bushwick. We partner with the theater, the Bushwick Star, and we bring in what we call eco-experts, scientists, and other people into the classroom to meet students, and then we guide the students in writing their own eco-plays, and then in April, we put up a professional production of those students' plays at the Bushwick Star with all adult actors, fully designed, a green design, and we bring the students in to see it and the public to see it. And then our third initiative is we collaborate with climate scientists. And through Lisa and Dana and PositiveFeedback, the last 3 years we've created original performances for the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory's open house. And they've been site-specific. So the first piece I made with Nikki was 2 years ago or so, and it was outdoors on this old road at the back of the campus with trees surrounding it, and we riffed on her studies of her dendrochronological studies, her tree science, and pieced together a kind of fairy tale about a kid who's lost his community, and the trees kind of come to life and speak to him, and we incorporated violin because they also do neat things like date violins sometimes. And we tapped into this idea of trees holding stories and histories, and that humans have a connection with trees. We hope to make a larger piece about dendrochronology and connecting it with Alaska and Alaskan tree scientists. So we're sort of in the process of applying for a program to do this, to have this cross-state partnership with both Alaskan and New York artists, but also Alaskan and New York tree scientists. So we would continue that project and make it expanded and make it bigger. And then last year we made a piece with Nikki and 6 other female climate scientists called Field Trip, a Climate Cabaret, and it was a musical with an ensemble of 7 women and original music and movement, and we did it inside the Oceanography building at Lamont to packed audiences, and we had to turn them away. And that one in particular, we were interested in exploring what Nikki mentioned, which is how can we introduce people to who scientists are and what they do. And so that's what we were doing with that piece, and that's definitely a big theme of what we do. Is theater has the unique advantage of creating human stories and connecting people to people, and something that I think Steve said, that climate change is about people, plays are about people, and so that's what theater can do, is talk about how people connect to this, and so it's been a true pleasure, not without its challenges, collaborating with Nikki, and I hope to do more in the future.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Nikki and Jeremy, can you hear me? It's
Yes.
Dana. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to lob some questions at our panelists here, but not without giving myself a little bit of context first. Number one, Lisa mentioned PositiveFeedback is the initiative that we started several years ago following a conference that Lisa co-organized called Tipping Point, which happened at Columbia, and whose aims were really to bring together for the first time in the United States climate scientists and art makers for simply the purpose of getting to know one another and having conversation. And lots of great stuff came out into the world as a result of that conference, and we picked up a small thread of it and have been trying to kind of make it go with PositiveFeedback. And the making it go in particular is about creating time and space for scientists, specifically climate change scientists and artists, so far time-based artists, but we haven't been totally exclusive about that, to simply be engaged with each other without a prescriptive determination of outcome. So even though we're talking about specific projects that we've been either connected to or are somehow having a family relationship to, we aren't a funding entity that supports the making of work so much as we are trying to create the incubated space where people from seemingly disconnected disciplines can actually find each other. One of the things that we have found from working with our artists and scientists is that oftentimes once they do get to know each other, or maybe just after they meet each other, they discover that they have a great deal more in common than not in common. They start with questions. They attempt to gather material together in a rigorous research process. They attempt to thread that together into some form or object or experience that can then be shared. And so it seems that there's a inherent common ground, and we're just attempting to make it possible for them to do more of that. So I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists, and I just want to confirm that we have till 3:45-ish. Okay. Okay, so 3 o'clock now. Last week we had as you do, we had the little offline, let's talk about what we're going to talk about conversation. I came up with a set of questions and told everybody what they were, and now I'm going to actually tell you that I've come up with a whole set of new questions over lunch. That's okay, you can have it. We're collaborating. So forgive me if I sound a little bit like a bumbling fool. I'm going to try to tie together some of the threads from the morning sessions. I thought the material in the room is already so rich. Why mess with that? Let's keep going with that stuff. So, okay. So my first question is actually for all of you, and maybe we can just respond in the reverse order. So Jeremy and Nikki, maybe you'd answer this first, and we'll come back down the line this way. It's really about getting started. Todd London spoke compellingly in his keynote about the I and the we. Which for someone or someone's engaged in work related to climate change is particularly resonant, since climate change is pretty much the urgent I-we issue of our time. So that spoke to me a great deal. He also talked about saying hello. And so we need to say hello. We need to say hello more often than we do. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to say something about the experience of saying hello to one another. We sort of know how you might have met, how the mechanics of that went, but I think maybe if you could talk a little bit about a deeper sense of saying hello. Steve gave me the look. And so Nikki and Jeremy, if you could take that on.
All right. So when the first time I spoke to Nikki, it was on the phone, and I was in the airport getting ready to fly somewhere. So it was a very, not necessarily an inspiring place or a quiet place, but we spoke for a while, and all I remember thinking is how stupid I am.
No.
And I don't mean that I was inarticulate, but that I realized quickly that it wasn't me being stupid, but that we spoke different languages, of course. And this is nothing new, I don't think, to this conversation. But that she was talking about her experiences and her work, and I'm not someone who is good at Googling and getting and absorbing first from a computer and then from a person. And so I really wanted to hear her describe her work personally. And so I was trying to absorb her work over the phone, and it was a challenge. And and I think I immediately realized both that we speak different languages, but also how complex the work can be, and how in art often it's we're working on the essential. We're diluting things down to what's essential, and yet with something like paleoclimate research, it's not so simple. And so to get a grasp on that, and also to find common ground of exactly what this means, what is this collaboration going to be, what are we going to make, was anxiety ridden for me to begin with, and that soon went away when we actually met in person, and I realized we had a lot more in common than I thought.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. Because I don't think it's hard. That's just interesting.
Of course
to
you
hear.
don't think it's hard.
Right. So I guess I didn't have a whole lot of experience working with artists, so I didn't have a whole lot. I think I was open to what could happen, and I didn't have too many expectations of where it would go, but it was very exciting. I get very excited about collaborating with people, especially new fields, so it was very exciting for me. And then it was also a matter of like trying to figure out with Jeremy, what are because there's so many different angles you could go, from the whole process of science to climate change and how we study climate change, to impacts on, I mean, there's so many directions. So to really focus on things that I think could resonate with people, and Jeremy might know what those things are better than I do, but just trying to find a place where we both wanted to do work to tell a story that would be interesting. Yeah,
Great,
that's it.
Great, thank you. So Seth and Inez.
Sure. Well, when we met 2 years ago at the CUNY Nature, Ecology and Society Colloquium, and I think that really speaks to the important role for events like that, like this that we have here, and also the events that PositiveFeedback hosts, in that they bring together people from the arts and from the sciences who are at least a little bit interested in doing things like this. And when I met Inez at the CUNY event, she was already given her own theatrical production that was related to the environmental issues. So presumably she's at least a little bit interested in this, right? And I was too. And so I think that makes these sorts of introductions and partnerships possible in a way that would, I think, be very difficult otherwise. I mean, I know countless scientists and academic researchers and all that, and like 3 artists, counting her. So it's really important to just bridge these gaps between communities that can, for better or worse, otherwise live in fairly separate worlds. And then, as far as how we went from there towards the Osama Scene Productions projects that we have, that I think it just emerged from the conversations that we had and the interests that we shared in promoting in a positive way the positive things that people can do to make a difference on climate change and on environmental issues in general. Now I'll note the second video that we're currently developing is in a somewhat different spirit. It's more about how much we care about each other across even distant times and places, potentially even including aliens from outer space. Thank you. And that's just because that's what I had grant money for from a research grant that's just winding down. But even because you like it. And sure, it's a worthy topic. But at the same time, it's it's been a good mix of been a good fusion, I think, of our interests. And I guess what we can also get some funding for, which is always important with these things, and so yeah, the spaces are really important though.
Oh, thanks. You got my back. Well, first I think on the literal end, I remember Seth coming up to me and being like, "Oh, I saw the performance that you just made about climate change," and I was like, I didn't see your presentation, and that felt kind of awkward. And then we started talking, and I was like, oh my God, this dude can listen so well. Like, he just listens. And then it's really, no, like, truly, it's amazing. And like, because as an actor, we're always like, oh, listen to your partner, you know what I mean? Or maybe you don't know what I mean. I don't know. Anyway, so I was really astounded by that, and I was also deeply flattered because I was like, oh my God, I'm saying something that someone's actually paying attention to. And a scientist to boot. I mean, it's got to be good if he's listening. And that kind of really like sparked, I think, the collaboration of like when people ask me what Seth does, I kind of want to be like, well, he's my friend. But I know that he's also a PhD that does amazing research. But our collaboration really comes from the friendship, I feel like. I don't, when I go to meetings, I'm not thinking of all the crazy research that he does. I'm thinking of listening to a story from my friend about something that he really cares about. And I think that's what makes our work, because he's patient with me when I don't understand something, and he doesn't tire of explaining it in a picture, in a short sentence, as a short story, as whatever it may be. And even though Seth says that he doesn't know how to make the video and everything, I really feel like scientists are like artists, much like what you were saying, Jeremy, that it's much more more in common than different. I mean, they ask questions and look for answers and are daring and are brave and ask questions that other people don't want to ask and do research late into the night and give their heart into everything. And these are all things I think about when I think of artists. So I think in that communication is really that we both really care about something. And I think we keep hearing it echoed that climate change is about people, art is about people, theater is about people, and people are about people. So I just like talking to my friend and having a good time and making things. And that also happens to be backed up by legitimate research and peer-reviewed papers and talks on Fox News and in Discovery documentaries. And that's just an honor for me.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Am I on?
You're on.
Cool. So our situation is somewhat different because Steve already sort of knew what he was up to by the time I came into the picture. And I think we first met, and I also met Michael, at a panel that was being held at Princeton that I heard about somehow and thought, this is actually happening? Like, this talk is happening? Because I had known for a year or two that, like, I wanted to do this, like, climate psychology thing. This was going to be, like, what I would try to focus on. And it's like, hey, someone is writing a play about that. So I showed up and was pretty quiet throughout the panel. And then at some point I said, yeah, that's what I do. And Steve was like, really? So from there, to some extent, I, more than other folks in the class, felt like I understood at least parts of what was trying to be done, such that I could like melt into the goals of the play, maybe more than some of the other folks in the class. And so I always found myself like sitting next to Steve and like trying to think of what his next thought would be. I don't know how well I did.
Often very good.
And I felt like it was a quick and like weirdly, I don't want to use the term synergistic because it's awful and jargony, but I think we understood each other relatively quickly.
Great. So here's my interpretation of saying hello. And I had all this time to think about it.
You're welcome.
And prepare. Yeah, I think, maybe just to start, one thing an idea that I live by, I think, is the notion that we change and we learn the most through direct contact with other people. At least that's the way a lot of us are wired. Certainly the way that I'm wired, and I'm a bit of a junkie for change and learning and transformation, which is why I do theater. I think the way that I do, that I am sort of most alive, most compassionate, or most engaged in the world when I'm encountering something new or pressing the limits of what I don't know. And often my main strategy for that is to go into somebody else's world. So that's my way of saying hello with a lot of people. For this project, just to maybe quickly give you the full scope of our interaction with scientists, because it was really many phases. It was researchers on this island in the Panama Canal, the Barro Colorado Island. Some scientists up in the Arctic at a sort of similar northern studies research center, walking around with people, testing their instruments, looking for polar bears, that type of thing. And then a pretty intensive relationship with all of these various faculty members at Princeton, many of whom, are real leaders in the field of climate change science or climate change communication, climate change policy. Quick sidebar on that. One thing that really impressed me with many of the Princeton faculty were how much they had accomplished in terms of climate change when they weren't climate scientists. Like Stephen Pacala, working up the wedge theory and talked to him for hours about climate change, and then asked him at one point, like, well, actually, what is your area? He's like, oh, I do the physics of rainforest canopies. Like, that's my science. It's like, I'm just doing this because somebody has to do it, which I feel like is an inspiration for all of us. And we were also lucky in Princeton that there's one of the world's major climate models is there. And we had a meeting with all of these very, very, very smart climate modelers and other conservation psychologists, Elke Weber here in New York at Columbia. Aaron's hooked me up with a couple other people. So it's been a kind of ongoing dialogue with all sorts of scientists, but in every instance, I changed the most by really somehow going into their world, and there's a sense that I'm not. Maybe it's just the change of environment and as well, but being on site with somebody, accompanying them at their work, and my other cardinal rule, which is to often just shut up and listen in those circumstances and really wait until I engage and do my side of the relationship. And I think the last thing I want to say about that is from our first trip, from this intensive time in Panama, thinking about small things, big things, time, the sort of huge natural systems of the planet, everything that we were learning in particular from these scientists, the conversations, what I brought to them, which was asking them questions like, how can you get up in the morning? How do you deal? You know so much bad news. Do you think there's a God who might somehow protect us? How do you things that they don't normally get asked, that provoked a different kind of conversation. And at the end of that first phase, I had a brief period of time when my consciousness really transformed. Like, for the first time in my life, I actually felt, not that I really felt, but I felt like I felt. Something along the order of natural time, like the real scope of time, all those big concept things that our little brains, certainly my little brain, can't wrap itself around. The scale of what we are doing to the planet, how quickly that's happening relative to natural time, just the complexity and wonder of the world and its interrelatedness. All those things which I have as concept in my head, but are usually too big. And when I had that transformation of consciousness, like 90% of what I considered to be important disappeared, just like shriveled up. And it was a revelation. And I thought it was going to be changed for life, and it lasted maybe 3 weeks. And I came back to life, and it all went back more or less to normal. But I know I had that experience. That experience came from saying hello. See, I'm bringing it back home. To these scientists' other worlds, and then that has been the epicenter of this play that we've been writing. We know it gave me a very visceral and tangible sense of what we are trying to accomplish, even if it's not accomplished. That is the North Star, that we are aligned towards and pointing towards.
Thank you. So this next question is probably more for Inez and Seth, and also Jeremy and Nikki. This morning, Migdalia said many beautiful things, including things I probably am too shy to say here. But one thing that she said that made its way into my notes was, shouldn't we pay artists who have something to say? And Lisa and I talk about this all the time, that part of the positive feedback enterprise, part of our whole project, is to make the case relentlessly that science ought to be in the business of supporting the collaborations between scientists and artists. And not simply because there's one job to do, which is the accessibility, translation, communication aspect, but because there's real impact to be made, a mutual impact to be made, how artists make what they make and how scientists investigate what they investigate. So I would love for Jeremy and Nikki and Seth and Inez to maybe respond to this issue of impacting each other, and how once you got past the saying hello and into the negotiating of language, how did you impact each other, and how would you like to be impacted in the future? Whoever speaks
You guys
first
want to
gets
go
it.
first?
Yeah, okay. There's an interesting research literature on the science of art. This is now the scientific study of art, including its impacts. And there was a good article I read by a neuroscientist who referred to artists as being, in a certain way, excellent neuroscientists. And the reasoning here was that art connects with our minds in a very specific way, in a even powerful way. I think maybe neuroscience is not quite the right, I would say maybe cognitive science, because it's not about the specific neurons, it's about our cognition, our minds, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and that art can engage with that, can connect with that in a very sophisticated fashion, and artists have been doing this since forever, really. As far as how I've been impacted, it's in getting a finer appreciation for how that process works, how to be able to think in terms of ourselves as human beings living and experiencing this world and encountering, whether it's theater, video, or painting, or really whatever else, and how that resonates with our minds and can really be impactful in our lives. My hope is that as a researcher, I can provide ideas for what sorts of impacts might be worth pursuing. There's some deep ethical questions lurking under there, in addition to all the science. And then to maybe try providing a few insights from the psychology research that's out there that can, I think, complement the skills that an artist brings to the table on this. It's interesting that you've been studying some psychology as well. I think there's a lot to be gained from that collaboration. I myself have been with the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions at Columbia for a little over 2 years now, and have benefited tremendously from that. And I think that experience has helped me bring a lot to the table in terms of our collaboration. And so, yeah, I think the impact really can go both ways, and that the net results of it can be very powerful in terms of developing kind of a sophisticated human experience.
This question brought like 5 things to my head, so I'm going to try to say them as coherently as possible. I think the first thing is that that's actually what we ended up doing with this project. We're filming a second video in April, and the funding is actually coming from a larger grant that Seth received to do his work. this time you started to mention, this time it's on temporal and spatial discounting, which Seth is still explaining to me. But I thought that was very interesting that it's, I think, under the outreach part of the grant, and so we're taking some of that and making our video. So it does work, thank goodness. And then I think going off of what you're saying about art impacting the mind, I literally just 2 days ago read something about the science of art in the Discover magazine from a couple months ago. And I think you always read about how art has existed always, and I think more than art, it's just stories. Like, we all just tell stories. That's all that we are, I feel like. Even from gossip to like sitting around a campfire to, you know, when the hurricane came and no one had any power, I heard a lot of stories. I think that's just like a very basic human currency that is easy to forget, but is also all around us. I mean, I think that's what Facebook is. It's like a cajillion stories that maybe you don't need to hear, but people want to share their stories and their thoughts. And along with that, I think artists are constantly spoken to about marketing yourself. You know, you want to be an actor, you have to market yourself. You're your own enterprise or company or whatever you want to think of it as. You know, you got to get on Facebook and you got to get a website and da-da-da-da-da. And I think it's the same for science. I think scientists have to market themselves, and they have a very tough problem of having to market themselves to these funders and the more scientific community, which is a more technical language, and writing for peer-reviewed papers and all that stuff. But they also, I feel like, are starting to realize through the scientists that I've spoken to that they also need to market themselves to the larger community. And that's where we kind of step in, I feel like. That we are their managers or agents or whatever it is that you want to maybe call it. And it is really important, and I think, again, it keeps boiling down to the more you can look at this research as stories of what is going on, then the more it becomes, you know, that you are just publicizing this story, and that's what artists do. And so it does make a lot of sense for these people to fund artists saying what they know and what they're discovering, because yeah, it's gonna make, you know, Joe Schmo know more about the research and not have a beautiful research paper for policy collect dust on a table of some politician somewhere. But that they can kind of hit the top tier of politicians and also kind of do this grassroots work of having us find out about this stuff and say, hey, wait a second, I don't want that to happen with my river or my lake or my lagoon or whatever it is. So I think that this current that we're all kind of a part of scientists and the artists working together is, I think, a really organic process, and I think that it does give a lot. Not to mention what the artist gets out of it too, but I think the science does gain a lot from it, if I may be so bold as to say.
Great, thank you. Okay, Jeremy and Nikki, you're up. I'm looking at you as if you can see me. That's ridiculous.
So that's interesting. I just wanted to add to something that Inez was saying, that not only is it good for scientists, but it's almost mandatory at this point, I feel. Maybe not so much with art, but I mean, the research that I do is almost entirely grant-driven. And I've been watching these calls, the requests for proposals for years, and just seeing the emphasis that they put on broader impacts, that scientists need to communicate their work and show that they have some kind of impact on education or the public. And this used to be something, it's always been in the language, but as I can see the emphasis playing more and more of a role. And I really do get the sense from the funding agencies that there's a sense of urgency to communicate the science. That's clear in the proposals. But the impacts on me working with artists have been definitely learning about how much we have in common. And the other thing is that I'm inspired to start a more local research program that I can incorporate more art and education into the research. And, you know, part of that is strategy as well, that I think that a funding agency would be interested in funding that if I can write smart and persuasive enough questions and show that this collaboration could really get traction and do something transformative. It's a big word in the funding agencies. Can you do something that's transformative? And I think that really is something that's transformative. So.
Yeah. So art can change culture. That's the give. I mean, we have years and years of examples of that. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Angels in America, Ansel Adams, right? And it changes our perspective on the world, but it absolutely affects culture. It makes memes, it changes culture. And so I personally, and this is a little controversial in the theater world, but I personally do believe that artists have a responsibility to nudge the evolution of people and culture in a positive direction. We have a responsibility. It can't just be anything we want or we care about. It can't be solipsistic. It has to be with the global in mind. That's just my personal feeling. So I think about, well, okay, so what if science is fueling that art, that responsible art making? And so therefore a new level of knowledge might be born into the future of culture. And in this case, I think our changing environment being the most important issue that we as humanity face right now in the world, to fuel that art with environmental science feels like there is transformation. There's there's an evolving culture that's moving in a productive and also activizing way. That's totally not a word. It's inciting action, right? And these kind of collaborations essentially, I think, can change the world in that way, in a very tangible way. Maybe slow, but in a very tangible way. So all of this, it's the similarity is the inspiration is true, but from the arts side, I think that with science integrated into the artistic process, you're talking about a mammoth change in a very positive way. At least I believe. And I also just wanted to mention that I forget who was talking about Steve was talking about the question to scientists, climate scientists, of you're surrounded by bad news. How do you wake up in the morning, or how do you deal with all of this on a moral level, on a human level? And what we on our last project at Lamont, we collaborated with Cynthia Rosenzweig, who works for the Earth Institute and for the NASA Goddard Institute, and she is basically a climate impacts leader, and she is the most positive person I've ever met in my life. And she is like a ball of sunshine as she talks about things like drought, and it's not because she puts on that face in order to win over audiences. It's because she truly believes that climate change is a positive story, and I think that something like that totally changed my entire perspective as an artist as far as how to make this art. What is it? So it's either like, guys, let's make a play about climate change, or let's make a play about climate change. Like, let's make a play about change, right? And if the public can not only absorb information and have a better grasp and better understanding of these issues and the science behind it, but also see it as something that is in our grasp to change. That change is something that's not only our responsibility, but something that's possible. And if art can help communicate that, then we're going somewhere, I think.
Great, thank you. And now a question for Steve and for Aaron, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience. during John Eisner's opening this morning, he talked about Cohen's theory of intimacy, which I didn't fully get. I don't know if anybody else had that problem, but I got a lot of it. And I started thinking about the practice of art making and collaboration as knowledge production. And since the work that you did together was in the factory of knowledge production in a university, I know you did have some challenges with that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the push and pull that you felt being in that space as an artist working in a semi-science context.
Yeah, we actually didn't really have any push and pull within Princeton. I think maybe we were referring to one of the things we talked about on our phone call before was just, it's been very interesting for us to be working on this play in the theater, supported by the National Science Foundation, so there's a strong relationship there. All these various partnerships and relationships with scientists and with the students that we collaborated with. And when we were in the world of Princeton, where there was a real, the play was very imperfect, it still is, but it was even more imperfect then, because we did our very first workshop of it. And actually talk about intimidating. I do this all the time. I put work up in front of people before it's ready, and you get feedback and learn about it. And that Princeton one was terrifying because there's a room of incredibly smart people with Nobel Prizes in science, and people who study specifically, some of the subject matter in your play. But they were so very nice at the end of the day, and so appreciative. And in a university setting where there's a hunger for ideas, where there's this expectation that that art and theater is a form where we are going to grapple with ideas and complex problems, and there's a hunger for complexity, and I think maybe less of an expectation for the kind of resolution and a certain kind of comfort that I think we expect from plays in, the professional theater, that Princeton really was sort of a utopia to work on this show, and and the conversations we had with both, the artistic students, the environmental students, and faculty on both sides, which ranged from accolades to constructive criticism, were all helpful, all profoundly helpful. And what I think has been harder is then trying to carry that project into regular theater land, where our American theater is gets a little tentative and shy, and is dubious, I think, of politics and ideas. And the last thing I would say is, particularly about climate change, part of what I think it makes all of this work so interesting is that whether you are totally, wherever you fall on the spectrum, I honestly believe that we all have some inbred, we have some wired in resistance to the truth, that we are in this profound crisis. I fully believed we're in this crisis, but oftentimes my first reaction to somebody telling me we're in this crisis is, well, who the hell are you? Why are you telling me I'm a bad person? I didn't like the way you said that. I'm going to discount it. I mean, any kind of reaction we can have to deny it or to preserve our identity, or what, all of those factors. So then carrying this type of project into theater world, and as I said, the play is still imperfect, but I'd say my sense is that it would have to be some platonic ideal of a perfect play, so perfect that it might not actually be able to exist in reality, in order for it to be smoothly embraced in the theater world, because it is a play talking about things that we wish didn't exist. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but here's Erin.
Thank
Hey,
So,
hey, Dana, can I jump in really quick?
Sure.
Is that going to interrupt your mode of thinking?
You've already interrupted. So it's
I
okay.
just-
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
No, I said you've already interrupted.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
I just wanted to share something, because we're at this conference, Wesleyan, and it's not just environmental science and art, but all science and art. And just to go back to your last question, there's a Vancouver group called Triumph that's it's part of Canada's Laboratory for Particle and Nuclear Physics. And so you're talking about, you know, Nobel Prize winning physicists, and they institutionalized a program recently where they bring in artists, and in order to work in partnership with the physicists to grapple with issues like oscillating neutrinos that the physicists don't really have a solid answer to. And I've been really inspired by this because it came from the science side. It's, you know, funded and supported institutionally, and it's and it's not just for aesthetic or for their lobby. It's legitimately to partner with artists on a real science problem that the artists are helping them solve. And what the guy who was speaking said, that the goal with that program is so that they collaborate on such equal terms that when that physicist wins a Nobel Prize, that physicist will reference that artist as in their write-up, which, you know, usually is just the top physicist who worked on that project, but the artist would be at that level. So I just wanted to mention it would be awesome if something like that were happening on as far as climate change science and art. And I think that would be really exciting, and it is really exciting that it's happening in Vancouver.
Great, thank you. We might come back to that. Erin, your experience.
Sure. So I experienced basically what Steve experienced as far as Princeton being really welcoming to this project, and still now in different ways trying to promote, especially in environmental sort of fields, this collaboration between artists and scientists. And I think, not to like overplug my alma mater, but I think Princeton isn't usual in that fashion in higher education. I think Princeton is both really appreciative of the discipline as something that young folks like me should like learn and get really embedded in, and also totally understanding of the fact that the most interesting work is interdisciplinary and wanting to promote that to get people to understand big problems better. However, so like thinking about why this project is hard, you could think about it, and it could be that some people at NSF do think about it as a behavioral intervention. And if you think of it that way, I have read a few papers, a few abstracts about things that are just, they sound totally insane and you can't believe that they've been done, but these experiments that have measured how to get people to make really concrete behavioral changes that change their impact on the environment. So things like, do you reuse your towels at a hotel? Do you use less energy, depending on what we tell you or what we give you or how we talk to you? And these sound like things like, how do you know that about a person? Like, how do you track that down about a person? But scientists respect that tracking down behavior change is one of the hardest problems, and it's also very relevant to environmental issues, obviously, because your attitudes can be anywhere, and if you're not changing your behavior, who cares? And I've seen all of these terrifically creative operationalizations, and I also know that there are a lot of nuts that have not yet been cracked, and everyone who, you know, had a PhD at the Princeton workshop knew that too. They knew that it's hard to crack a nut like this. So I think there's actually a lot of understanding among communities like that. And I now work at a company that's running a really stupidly enormous behavioral intervention, O-Power. So I sort of believe that if we wanted to treat this play as an intervention and measure changes in behavior, we could probably figure out a way to do it. It just would be strange, and people would raise eyebrows about how ethical it was.
Do we have to wrap up at this exact moment, or could we have like 3 more minutes? Okay. So I had another question I was going to ask, which relates to what Jeremy was talking about, but I'm not going to ask it. It just has to do with being invited in and taking residence in somebody else's universe. So just think about that. So we're going to invite questions, and so I'm going to, I guess, walk around with them. Oh, she's going to walk around with the microphone. So if there are questions from the audience for any of our panelists, we just ask that you direct your question to one of the teams just to keep things kind of moving. So.
Hello, my name's Kristin Evans. I'm a playwright, and I'm collaborating with some scientists on a project at the moment, which wasn't something I'd planned to do. It's going to be a little difficult to aim my question at a particular pair, but really, as I'm listening, I'm kind of thinking about the field of science funding and the move towards working with artists. I was very happy to hear you say that what you wanted to foster was an open-ended conversation, because one of the things that I am hearing from some of the comments is to do with how can art serve science? You know, how can art get stories told and put out there about what science is discovering? And I just want to suggest that art making is not fundamentally an instrumentalist activity that is about telling stories. Media agents can do that. I think there is a great deal of potential and possibility in learning from how art is made and how art relates, for example, to structures of time, to structures of thought, to ways of creating different ways of looking at something. And I suggest that looking at the power relationships between the funding structures of art and science is really important to considering how those conversations are fostered. If artists are coming in as the messengers of scientists, you know, I think the possible crossovers that some people have talked about very excitingly about approaches and ways of experimenting and ways of looking at the world in new and different from new and different angles. At its heart, that's what art making, as opposed to advertising or presenting stories, is about. I feel that art making in this country is incredibly squeezed by instrumental pressure from all sides, and I would like to see whether there's a possibility for a conversation between artists and scientists to also respect the experimentation and structural innovation that art making can do, and whether there's learning that can be done from both sides on that.
I'm chomping at the bit to respond to that, and Lisa punched me in the arm and said, "You can take this one." This is my. If I have a bailiwick, that's it. When we started to cook up this whole project, I can't tell you the number of times I just pissed people off by saying we can't. It can't just be that. We have to allow. We have to create the space for the artist to have impactful, meaningful, sustained, interventive influence on scientific practice. Or there's really, that's the project I'm not interested in. That's somebody else's project. So your point is well taken, and we have had that conversation, even amongst this group, we've had that conversation a number of times. I will say that you have to start somewhere. And this is where we started. We started with a blend of both taking on the translation project and also the creation of potential innovative opportunity project, and we're going to get there. But it will take a little time because of the lack of parity that you describe. And Steve wants to respond also.
Oh, I just had a quick thought, which is, yeah, I guess what I would hope for is a sort of philosophy and partnerships that resist the split between science and art. And the way I think of my theater work that relates to science isn't so much that the ideas of science are passing through a play, but that I'm writing a play which is about society in its larger environment, everything about the shell, the superstructure that surrounds society, and that within society we have a lot of false premises because we don't integrate a lot of what science does know. We integrate a lot of what it gives to us with technology, but it's certainly not integrating what environmental or climate scientists know. And so I think there's a way to frame it where it's all of a whole, that artists should be making art about the real society that we live in that does include things which sometimes are otherwise invisible.
And I think that, Jeremy, were you trying to get my attention to respond to that? I saw movement over my shoulder. No. Okay. Really? Okay. So we'll take one. I'm shocked. I'll take one more question.
On? Oh, yeah. I'm Alexis Clements. I'm a playwright as well. And I just want to add to the last couple of points that were made, just to say it's interesting, right, as a writer, you pay attention to what people are saying, and everyone in the panel has deferred to their scientists as more intelligent. And I just want to point out, because it pings a binary that was brought up earlier, that there are, or maybe Steve didn't, I'm sorry. No. Well, I just mean to point out that there's a hierarchy of knowledge that's taking place there, and that's pinging the binary and chain of being conversation that was brought up at the beginning, where we presume scientists to be the most intelligent beings, sort of. And that's false, right? That's a false dichotomy. It's a false chain. And I think what's important to pick up on what Kristin was saying and the point that's being made is artists have a different kind of intelligence that they focus on, not necessarily exclusively, right? But there are different types of intelligences. And I think it's really important when we talk about this to resist that hierarchy, because that's reinforcing everything that's Kristin was bringing up. It reinforces the idea that artists are in the service of, as opposed to providing their own benefit to society through what excuse me, through what they do. I have a crumb in my throat. Sorry.
We totally agree with you. Okay, we'll take one more.
Can I make a comment on that really quick?
How about a question?
Just what she was saying. It also, it doesn't help scientists with connecting to a public either. You know, it just makes scientists this on a pedestal, inaccessible, they're these perfect people, and then students can't relate to them. So it's so important that scientists communicate all their failures. They're not used to doing that.
Okay. One more question, and then we have to wrap it up.
Hello, my name is Nora Galvis. I'm from the scientific point of view, and I would like to answer that the more we know that we don't know, because we always asking questions and we keep doing research to learn more. And I'm from Colombia, and we are doing research there, and we also work in an environmental education programs, and we reach also the media. And for me, it's very important these kind of talks and discussions with artists and with journalists and with people in order to understand the language and to get a message to the public. And that's what my question is to Erin, because we have some case studies and we have to make changes in the behaviors, and most of the time we just get changes in the attitudes. People say, I agree with recycle, but not in my backyard. So we want to make changes in the behavior. And I would like to listen to a comment of all of you, the panelists, about what is better to have. I listen that the positive message is good, but and to have real behavior changes, sometimes it's good also to have a catastrophic point of view saying you have to act now, because we go to many international meetings and people, even the scientists, they just say you should walk instead of use a car, and they rent a car after the meeting and go just for blocks, they start walking. So they don't apply what they're saying. And my question is, for you and your experience, all the artists that here also, you have seen impacts in the people when you are approaching in a negative way that say this is what is happening, or is something that you can do that is still hope?
Why don't you want to take that?
Sure, I can start. So I think where scientists come from is they actually want to treat people not unlike artists want to treat them, which is, with the possible exception of behavioral scientists, which is, you are an intelligent, complete being, and I trust you to some degree to, if I tell you something, like try to grapple with it and understand it and think through it. It's sort of like not didactic necessarily, but thinking if I put this thought into the world, it will be considered. And the change in someone's thought from what I say or do will play into their being in some like complex, rich human way. And I think that it's great that both scientists and artists appreciate their knowledge or art-making productions, and they think about humans in this way. Behavioral scientists, and increasingly business, who has a Facebook account, view humans differently, frankly. They view humans as machines with knobs and levers to pull or push, and those knobs and levers can elicit changes. So when I say you can have a behavioral intervention, I mean across an enormous population, however different, however diverse, however uniquely each person believes they think and actually does think consciously, there's some things we have in common deeply and that we have in common with many animals that allow an intervention, not necessarily a book or a play or a scientific paper, but an intervention like showing you how you compare against your peers. Like, are you more or less inclined to be wasting energy and like spending a lot on your electric bill than your peers? That like has an impact on people that's measurable and consistent. And why? Like, why should it? It's not like narratively interesting. It's not that intellectually interesting, but it taps into something. So the way to change behavior is sometimes to forget that people are people and to think about them just in terms of like, what do I know about how to change behavior? And that's horrifying, right? Like, we don't want to be essentialized like that. No one does. If you're getting, admitted to college or a job, you don't want to be made into a number. You want to like interview and like write a cover letter and express yourself individually. So I'm glad that both sides of that coin exist. And it's going to be an interesting time in the coming decades figuring out how people are treated by institutions, especially who want to change their behavior.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up, as all good conversations are. It gets good at the end, right? Which sucks, you have to end. But Lisa's going to have the last word.
Well, I hope that this is just a last word leading to many other last words. Back on that parity issue, Positive Feedback really, really strives to ensure parity between artists and scientists. And one of our methods of making introductions have been framing artists and scientists coming together in kind of like a dating contest, a dating game. We did a speed dating event last year, and coming up later on this month, we're having an artist and scientist dating game at the Met. And when we've kind of played matchmaker a little bit. We'll see how it goes. We're not sure if they're all going to hit it off.
It sounds ridiculous, but it's not. It sounds absurd, but it's not. Believe me.
So if you're interested, if you want to pick up one of our bookmarks, our website has the information. It's March 27th at the Met as part of DJ Spooky's artist in residency there. I want to thank again everyone here at NYU and No Passport for hosting us, and especially the technology team. We were the tech panel with the video and the Skype, and thank you, Jeremy and Nikki, and all of our panelists and Dana for joining us here today. We're very appreciative. Thank you.